All right. Hello, everyone. Sorry we're a few minutes late. I know we're going to slowly have you adding in here. We had some technical difficulties, but I think we are all here. So we're going to give it just a minute for all of you to be able to join and see us and make sure we're connected. And then we will get started with this panel discussion. So thanks for your patience as we work through technical difficulties, all part of 2020, right?
Absolutely.
All right, we are up to 30 people. So people are slowly coming in. Just again, we're just going to give it another minute. Thanks for your patience and we apologize, but technology was not our friend for the last half hour here. So let me just see if the participant number climbs a little bit more. And if not, then we'll
Okay.
go ahead in just a few minutes or just a minute. All right, let's see.
Oh, hello, Sandra.
Hi, Tandra. Thanks. Thanks for your patience. All right, you know what? For the sake of time, let's go ahead. It looks like we're slowly adding a couple people, but that number stayed pretty consistent. So again, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. We apologize for the delayed start. We were having some technical difficulties if you didn't hear that when we first jumped on here. But again, thank you for being here. My name is Courtney Collins. I am the Regional Director of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and I oversee the Illinois and Missouri chapters. So I just wanted to welcome you quickly and thank you again for joining us for this important topic and discussion. And I'm going to pass it over to Dimple, who's going to moderate this discussion and give you a little bit more information, as well as introduce our panelists that joined us this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Courtney. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Dimple Patel, and I serve on the board of directors for AFSP Illinois. And I'm also the co-chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, along with Meg and Sean, who are behind the scenes right now, so you can't really see them, but they're there. So we want to start by having this discussion where we all want to learn how to do better and choose our words more carefully and how to be more inclusive. Although we might make mistakes, we want to create a more inclusive environment in our community. Today, we'll be talking about how we can support our youth during these times of increased racial disparities, COVID-19, and a different looking school year. We know that intersectionality is real, and we hope to bring together some of these topics this evening. Mental health can be particularly difficult to discuss and is in underrepresented communities. And recent acts, as well as increased visibility of racism and violence and the mental health disparities of COVID-19 are taking a toll on mental health. Students in particular are having disruptions in their routines while also handling these grown-up problems. The pandemic is not the only has not only presented many challenges to our students, but to educators, parents, and caregivers as well. Children already struggling with mental health conditions have been especially vulnerable to these changes because of services that they would typically receive in a traditional education setting and are being stretched thin as educators are adjusting to virtual learning, even though it's been a couple months. Additionally, social distancing measures have made it harder for children to safely connect with their friends and loved ones. Despite the existence of effective treatments, we find that disparities in racial and ethnic minorities make receiving adequate mental health care very difficult. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality reports that racial and ethnic minority groups in the US are less likely to access mental health services, less likely to use community mental health services, more likely to use emergency departments, and more likely to receive lower quality of care. In addition, cultural factors also influence one's willingness to seek psychological assistance. These factors contribute to poor mental health outcomes, including suicide among racial and ethnic minority communities. With that being said, I would like to introduce our panelists. First up is Dr. Rhonda Boyd, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. Boyd, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do?
Yes. I'm very pleased to be here with you all today to talk about this important issue. In my work, I'm a clinical child psychologist, and so part of what I do is actually work with teens with depression. It's who I mostly see. I'm associate director of our child and adolescent mood program, and as part of that program, we do extensive evaluations for children and teens who come in with mood symptoms, and we also provide a range of evidence-based treatment, and we also do conduct research and try to understand what are the risk factors and protective factors for youth with depression. We've been seeing a lot more youth presenting with suicidal ideation, behavior, self-injurious behaviors, and so we've been expanding our work, my team, to look more at risk for suicide and suicide prevention among youth.
Thank you so much, and for all the work that you do. Next, I'd actually like to introduce Dr. Catherine Wax, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and the founder of Lincoln Park Psychology. Dr. Wax, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do and what your area of focus is?
Sure. So really quick, once in a while I might mute myself just so everybody knows, because I have a house full of children and people and it's never quiet. So just in the sake of not interrupting, I may mute myself once in a while. I'm so excited that you asked me to be a part of this, but even before I talk about myself, I just have to say this is like the biggest feeling of like imposter syndrome, right? In topics that are so heavy and so intense, and kind of wondering, what do we actually know? So I'm really excited to have an actual, conversation about it, and clearly to learn what I don't know. Like Dimple said, I'm the founder of Lincoln Park Psychology, which is a psychology group in Chicago. It's a newer group right now. I'm transitioning out of a role where I was head of clinical and the training director for an APA internship program for Connections Internship Consortium. So essentially, I was the head of clinical for the clinical programs in 5 therapeutic day schools in the suburbs of Chicago. So the students that we service in those schools are ages 6 to 21 and have a whole host of presenting issues, including developmental disorders, depression, anxiety. Clearly, we deal with a lot of crisis management and risk assessment in the schools as well. So that's been kind of an interesting side to also be on, as far as being kind of the leader of a school and having to make decisions from the COVID perspective, as far as what's necessary safety wise, and then also what's necessary mental health wise for our students. So it's been quite a ride trying to figure that out. So I'm transitioning out of that role and I'm going to be running this practice full time, but I'm still doing that right now.
Well, thank you so much for introducing yourselves and telling our guests a little bit more. So either one of you can start off by answering this question, but let's just bring in with a little bit more general questions about mental health. But what is one of the biggest struggles that you're noticing during these times, especially with remote learning, parents either working from home, kids doing school from home? What are some of the struggles that you've noticed?
Sure. I can start. One that I've noticed is many of the youth report feeling isolated from peers. Is one that come up frequently, and typically working with kids with depression, behavior activation, getting them to be engaged in activities, connecting with peers is something that I've always worked to do. And so now it's really much more challenging because the type of activities I would tend to encourage kids to do, they can't do for safety reasons now. Also, the virtual learning is a struggle. It's many times it's not conducive to how some youth learn. Some youth are fine with it and some are not. And so right now it's kind of a all-one approach. And they have difficulty concentrating. And so I've noticed a lot of complaints about teachers giving them a lot of work and having trouble keeping up and dealing with what's going on with COVID, what's happening politically, as well as the schoolwork.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What's kind of interesting I think I have a perspective from being in the mental health field, but then also just being a parent and being friends with parents and kind of seeing what other people's experiences are. And it's been interesting to see. There are definitely students, like you said, who are, feeling very isolated, feeling very alone, really need that social outlet. I would consider my child in that category. But then there's also what I've seen is pretty interesting is there's been some students who I know who have been doing very well and who've been really thriving because they have school anxiety and being in a classroom and having to perform in front of people and answer questions in front of the class or read out loud. There's a safety, a feeling of not being safe in that situation. And some of them are feeling much safer. Of course, we have the total opposite side where there are children who are not in safe environments at all. And being home is incredibly stressful, and e-learning isn't even a thing because survival is a thing, right? So, I mean, you have both sides of the spectrum, but.
And with that being said, like one of my follow-up questions is, what's the number one thing that caregivers can do to support their children at home during these times? And how can we help protect their mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely speak to that. I think the first thing that comes to mind is to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. So I think that caregivers, there's a lot of stress, and that clearly trickles down to kids, right? I mean, kids are a barometer for the stress in the home and for their environment. And for a lot of caregivers, it's impossible to not have more stress right now because of the situations. So I think managing your own stress level is really helpful. I think that normalizing the experience for kids, like that this isn't normal and that this is weird and isn't supposed to feel good all the time. I think that makes them think that there's nothing wrong with them because they're having the reactions that they're having. So, normalizing that is great. I've had a lot of conversations with parents about setting realistic goals. There seems to have been a big change in what was e-learning in the spring, which was kind of just a temporary, we didn't know how long this was going to be. So for some programs, it was a really simple half an hour a day Zoom meeting. And all of a sudden now, at least in Chicago public school system, we're talking about 5 hours a day online. So, so I think the expectation was we want our kids to learn, which is great, but I think it's helpful for parents to set really realistic goals. Maybe a realistic goal is just don't hate school, or, learn a little math, or sit and participate as much as you can, or, things of that nature versus I expect you to continue your straight A average, or, things like that I think there's just a lot of pressure in general on kids. So in my mind, setting those really realistic goals also relaxes parents a little bit too, because they don't feel like the kids aren't meeting their expectations, which then goes into the parental psyche of how well you're doing as a parent, et cetera, so it kind of relaxes everybody's anxiety. Those are things I can think of.
Yeah, and I'll just add one of the things about making routines as much as possible. I've really been talking to many of the youth about their sleep schedules, because as we know, if your sleep gets disrupted, it's hard to function. And so particularly when you're like home all day, it's hard to even know what day it is, which we all. So sometimes they may stay up late. And so really trying to make that balance, eating healthy, just moving around and not just like laying in bed all day. Because now you can actually take class in bed almost, so it is an issue about getting up. Those things about self-care for the whole family and, setting some routines, family dinners or things like that people can do to sort of help the family kind of stay in a routine.
And that's like something I've also said to the students that I work with as well, some of the high school students, of taking a break. If you have that passing period between classes, like get up, move around. And the other part is like, where can you also do like schoolwork, not from your bedroom? Like, can you go to the kitchen table, dining room table, somewhere else where you're not doing it, where it's so easy to just hop in bed and like, oh, I'm going to take a quick nap. But the other thing I'm also hearing is that motivation piece, because it's home and it's more relaxed, either a safe place. So those are some things that also have kind of come up. But On the flip side of it, what are some positives that you've kind of noticed with how caregivers are supporting their children or how kids are supporting themselves?
Go ahead, Dr.
I,
Boyd.
I think people are being very creative. I think that's what I've been sort of amazed with. Families coming up ways to stay connected using virtual formats. And so also I've been talking to youth about, things that they always held off or didn't do to start. So some of my patients are like painting now. Some of them have started businesses where they're making bracelets and selling them online. So those are the kind of things that are like fascinating. We should come up when you think of positive, maybe with something new, a new hobby, something that we can grow during these negative times. They are stressful. And so if you can maybe, see the little rose from the concrete.
We actually have a question from a parent. How can parents balance supporting their children in remote learning and supporting their mental health? I have given my children permission to be done with work, especially for children with who struggle with ADHD.
Yeah, I mean, I think in those situations, like I said before, setting the expectations is something to promote success. So especially, for example, if you have a student with an IEP who needs accommodations, those are really hard to come by right now. I mean, trying to get those met. But I think you add an extra layer of suffering to yourself by being upset about that versus trying to work something out or set some expectations that the child can be successful at. So in the example of ADHD, if this is a student who really is having a hard time sitting in front of the screen, clearly work with the teacher. But if you can't work with the teacher in that way, just kind of setting these little markers for really positive reinforcement, which I think doesn't just change the way that the child looks at e-learning, but then also changes the way that you look at the child, right? Where you're starting to kind of reframe success in a different way. And I think that really does help your, help your mental health level a little bit. But I mean, it takes some training. I mean, it's not like you're just going to decide, oh, my expectations are lower and that's it. The next day they'll be higher again. You have to keep, you have to kind of keep reminding yourself to reframe this time that it's very, very different. And quite frankly, I have no idea what the outcomes are going to look like in the future, but I think it'll be really interesting if we find out that really the long-term effects of this were not that big of a deal, right? And we're stressing over things that we don't actually know are going to have any major long-term effects yet, right? So living in the present, being mindful of like what's happening right now today is really helpful in kind of like centering your own mental health level and your own anxiety over it.
So speaking of, I wanted to also address a little bit about how caregivers can support their children if they have thoughts of suicide or either have self-injured, and what actions can they take without either violating their trust, or let's say if another parent is against getting additional support or going to the hospital, what can parents do if they're very concerned and kind of coming across all these little barriers?
So one of the things, if it's your own child, I assume that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would look for mental health services as quickly as possible. We know how long that is could vary, but in a sense also trying to figure out what could be some of the triggers for the youth, sort of what is sort of causing the youth to either cut or have these thoughts. Are there things, if you can identify, maybe it's something with a peer. Sometimes it's something that may be going on social media. Mm-hmm. And also figuring out what are ways that the teen youth can soothe themselves, distract themselves when these things come up. And also, if there's safety issues, doing check-ins. I always encourage parents to check in. How are you doing now? Try to keep that communication open, and also not to get extremely upset. Teens often tell me that they won't talk to their parents about how they're feeling or when they want, because the parents get angry at them. They perceive it as anger. So the parents get upset to hear that your child wants to die. And so that makes the teen withdraw. So parents have to stay calm and have these conversations in a way that keep their child safe and open up the communication between the two.
And what do you, what if like their child has a difficult time expressing their emotions? How can parents kind of go about that?
So for the youth that I work with that had trouble verbalizing, sometimes we use writing as a way so they can write it down, or even drawing. So there's other ways that they can communicate their feelings, and which fits the youth.
Okay, thank you so much. I actually wanted to go into a little bit about our diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation that we're already having, kind of go a little bit more in depth. And so I wanted to ask both of you, feel free to jump in. How are kids affected by systemic racism? And what systemic issues have you noticed? And how can we do a better job to overcome them or even have conversations about them?
I mean, and I think in the work that we do in the schools, because it's because of the nature of it, being in a school, that in itself is like this mini system. So these things tend to come up, pretty often. I mean, I think in answer to the question, and just to be clear, I'm so not an expert on, these things, and I'm learning as I go. But in answer to the question, how are kids affected by racial violence? I mean, I think it's an element of trauma, right? I mean, I think it fits the definition of a traumatic event, which does not have to happen directly to the person, can just be a story that somebody told or something that they saw on the news, and that causes a trauma response. I think a harder element of that is that it's not necessarily situational. It's something that's lived, right? It's something that is an identifier. So it's not just, well, this situation happened and now it's over, right? So it's kind of an ongoing complex trauma situation for students. Dr. Boyd, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Well, there's a history of systematic oppression, racism for many BIPOC individuals in this country. And so it comes up in almost every area of life. And so it happens where in the criminal justice system, in the education system, in the mental health system, in the regular health system. And so it plays out that many times, actually, youth may not be aware of how these factors affect. It affects where they live, their access to higher education, to jobs, in so many ways in which need to be impacted. It's coming up light because of COVID, but it's been around for centuries in this country. And so I'm glad that there's these discussions now about it and that people are paying attention. And so youth are likely being more aware, because it may have seemed like there had been some progress in many ways based on the civil rights movement many years ago, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. And this kind of is leading to like a next question. It's a question I have, but also a participant has as well. What's the best way for educators and families to address these issues with children and adolescents, and like how can they begin to have these conversations? And also supporting those kids' own mental health issues, and especially during remote learning.
One of the things, you want to be developmentally appropriate. So what you may say to an 8-year-old is different than the conversation you have with a 12-year-old and a 17-year-old. And so you want to be honest, and you want to hear from them of how they're interpreting the situation and help them figure out based on their developmental needs. They know what's going on. Kids are talking, they're exposed. And many times parents think kids don't know about certain things going on, but they do, and they talk. And so you want to sort of help them sort of frame all of what they see and help them understand it based on where they're at developmentally.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think the other thing to do is, especially for educators, there's, I think, a tendency to hear something that might be emotionally charged or might feel like we don't know the answer, and we shut that conversation down, right? And I think that one of the things to be sure of is that when these topics come up, we don't say, now's not the time. And quite frankly, sometimes it's not. You could be in the middle of a math lesson, right? And we can say, I totally want to hear what you have to say. This is so important. Let's chat in a little bit, right? Table it, take a note. So that's understandable, you know, to keep them on track. But I think that, I think because it's so emotionally charged, I think sometimes that discourages the conversations, obviously. So I think it's good as educators to also understand that you're not being asked to know all the answers. You're also not being asked to make it better or make somebody feel happy. I don't even feel that way as a psychologist, you know, because I think if you give the space and you ask broad questions, you know, what are your thoughts around that?
Well,
Here's a
actually,
typical psychologist question. How does that make you feel? Right? I mean, like those types of things that are kind of these bigger picture
yeah.
questions. It opens up the space for validating that this is really important and you don't really have to weigh in, right? I mean, you really don't.
But how would you approach it with individuals who either like are worried about, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I don't describe it well? Or what if I offend somebody? What about for those individuals who want to have a conversation, but just kind of don't know how?
Yeah, are we talking about like educators or students?
In general, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the theme right now, one of the best themes I'm hearing is just that uncomfortable conversations are the norm and they're expected, right? So I think in certain situations, when you have control over a group, setting group rules and setting expectations as a group is a really good practice, even for classrooms, especially over remote learning where they're not seeing each other. I think that there's a practice of calling people in instead of calling people out, where you're kind of suggesting like, that's not really, you know, how we say this, you know, it actually works better if you say it this way, instead of calling people out, which is to call them a name or suggest that this is a, that they have a particular personality trait, you know, or something like that, when people tend to get defensive. But I don't think that those things are avoidable. I think that people are going to feel uncomfortable and that it's going to be, it's not always going to feel like a great conversation, but I think the acceptance of that will help with having it, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think we also don't want to make assumptions. Sometimes as adults, we may assume when a youth says something that we know what they're talking about. Listening and really hearing the words that they use and how they're putting it and reflect it back and sort of understanding. And if you have an openness to have that conversation and try to understand, even if you don't agree, but sort of understand where their view and sort of what's going on so that you can have a dialogue, I think is important.
And have you noticed that since, like, you know, a lot of things are more on social media, there's easier access to kind of, how would you say parents or even teens can handle, or even younger kids handle racism that is either on sites as Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, all these social media platforms? Like, what are some approaches that you would recommend parents to take, or even kids themselves?
I mean, social media is a huge influence, I guess, overall for everyone, but particularly for young people. And so one of the things, someone did a study a couple of years ago in which they showed that actually like Black and Latinx youth who watched videos, online videos of racism happening to someone in their own group had more depression symptoms and post-traumatic stress symptoms. So I do want to emphasize that it does have a negative impact, which I think people don't realize as much. For parents with younger kids or early teens, I always encourage them to monitor social media. I know for 16, 17-year-old parents, you know, that they may not be able to monitor in that sense, but in a sense, have these conversations. I always encourage you to not keep watching the videos over and over again. That's not healthy. I know they want to see what's going on, and they are exposed to those. I actually they need to sometimes take breaks from social media and not be over flooded when it's too overwhelming about what's going on. So those are ways to sort of try to limit the amount, because a lot of things do happen on social media, and you are exposed to a lot of bullying, racial bullying online, which parents may not even be aware of.
And how do you, Dr. Bird, you brought up a really good point of like racial bullying online. What are some things that you've seen and or heard from like the individuals that you work with, the clients that you see?
Recently, I heard someone saying, which I'm not even sure because they have all these new things, but there was a game, and I guess you make posters on the game. It was kind of a young kid game, or maybe not, but they were, the person put a flyer up, a poster that said Black Lives Matter, and then people start attacking my patient, saying all lives matter, and then saying racial remarks to the patient. And so that sort of, and we talked about it. I'm actually not even sure if the patient told the parents, but I was glad it came up, and we talked about how that made the patient feel and sort of what we could do. If that happens in the future, you can get off. What does that mean when someone doesn't support your belief in Black Lives Matter? And so we had those kind of conversations. So those are things that happen on social media. If people express their views, other people may attack them and have another view. And so things are politically charged in our country right now.
Dr. X, did you have anything to add to that?
You know what? No, I think that that's right on the money. I also think that there are a lot of good things about social media. And I think that there are ways that parents can do research to find groups for their children to feel a sense of belonging in, right? So I think that there are formed groups out there that I think are like-minded or value-driven with the same values. Just like on the negative side, I think there's the positive ones as well. And I think it's really helpful for parents to do research on that and try to manage the transition from those more negatively impacting groups to the kind of similar value groups, right? I think especially right now, because everybody's so isolated, feeling a sense of belonging is really important. And I think that that's another way to go with some of those social media things.
Speaking of, Tandra just mentioned, which is a really good point. She said that there's a lot of racism and hate in gaming. And so parents also being mindful of like the chat conversations that are going on and being vigilant in that aspect as well. Thank you, Tandra.
Yeah, that's a good point. It does come up because youth are playing games with people all over the world at times.
And it could be even adults that kids are playing against and you don't even know like who's on the other side. And I think also social media allows people to kind of hide behind the screen with a fake account or anything and really kind of go after certain individuals with certain beliefs, and being able to just have those conversations or reaching out to an adult where you can express those feelings and knowing that support can be there, or even like going to your teacher or letting somebody know. One of my next questions is, how can we make sure that our youth's needs are being met despite social distancing, making typical resources unavailable?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the points that, you know, if I'm hearing your question right, one of the points that I was making about kind of a sense of belonging, I think that that is a really big deal. And I think that we've learned at this point enough technology, or if we haven't, we can YouTube it, right? We can figure out how it works because there's a video on YouTube of somebody doing it, right? So, but I think that if we can create senses of connection, you know, in whatever form, and really, I think in the school system, even having small breakout rooms in your classroom, the breakout groups that Google Meet can use now, and I know that Zoom can meet, those types of more intimate conversations, especially when we're dealing with classrooms of 30 kids that are all on the screen together in these little bubbles. I think that promotes a sense of togetherness and belonging for some of them. I think even having like privately scheduled meetings with your teacher once in a while, or having students assigned to a faculty mentor or something like that, so that they do feel a little bit more connected to people that are outside the home. I definitely think that those are ways that we can promote. I mean, my theme just keeps going with belonging, right? People just need to feel like they belong to a group, they're understood, so as much as we can get groups like that together, committees, whatever, those things, and student-led groups are really important because it gives them a sense of power, which a lot of people feel like they don't have right now. Nobody knows when this is going to be over. We're kind of at the whim of the politicians to tell us when we can leave, et cetera. So having something that's student-led gives them a sense of kind of ownership over something that's bigger than them, which I think helps a lot with their mental health. I don't know if that answered your question.
It did. It did. Dr. Boyd, were you gonna say something?
Oh, well, no, I mean, I agree
okay.
about.
You're going to say something.
And I was kind of in my head in agreement. It is about, even some of the like extracurricular activities, doing them virtually. Mm-hmm. I know sometimes a lot of those have been canceled, but whatever they can do virtually would be helpful. Mm-hmm. Can you see me? Okay.
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay. I may have to get my charger. It looks like it went out for a second. So yes, I think those kind of pieces are very important.
And I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit. But there's certain aspects that we're not being able to do in person, right? Like the connection piece of it, or resources at school that would typically be offered. How do racial disparities affect children or teens during this time, especially?
I think it gets back to what you started with initially, is about sort of that many times BIPOC communities do not access treatment or get adequate treatment. And so particularly with the schools being closed, a lot of racially diverse children get mental health services in school, and now many of that has been cut back, even sort of outpatient clinic hours and things. So we're having an issue of whether there's enough providers, people to get youth in quickly. That's always been a case with seeing child and adolescent mental health professionals. There's not enough of us. And so this is particularly an issue now because the need is increasing rapidly, it appears. And we always encourage for prevention to start early, to get youth in early, and we are. But I think telehealth offers a lot of opportunity. There's challenges too, whether people have access to telehealth, the technology, but there's kind of these pluses and minuses. So I'm hoping telehealth may bridge the gap. We don't know that. That's where we will eventually find out is, will it help with this gap in getting access to BIPOC communities?
Yeah. I think another thing to think about too is, I think quarantine or shelter in place is a privilege. The whole idea of when we first kind of closed everything up in Illinois in March, I think that there are communities who can't stay home because they need to go to work, and their children need somewhere to go. So there's a family down the street who's hosting all of the children, and things like that. So I think just those communities pulling together in that way, but not necessarily being given the resources to be able to manage all of that stress. I think, I think even if educators can add more social emotional learning this year into their curriculums, right? I mean, if you're teaching kids learning or, reading comprehension, throw something in there about how to manage your emotions, because you're still getting the reading comprehension. It's just the topic has changed, right? So, I mean, I really do think that there's opportunities for a lot of social emotional learning in the classroom, since, like you said, they're not in the building where they would normally access those things. I also think schools should have a referral list of people available for their students to see, either telehealth or otherwise, that they're not just education environments or not just academic environments. This this is a whole other system that the children grow up in, besides their family life. So
No, especially, and like, just like, to add a few things, I think the other part is too of like even having basic things like a computer or like a Chromebook or internet access. These are some things that a lot of like certain individuals don't have, may not have access to unless they're in like the school setting. And the other part is even with referralists, I remember like when I first went to therapy in college that I was asked if I wanted to work with a South Asian clinician. And I initially had said no because of the shame and stigma surrounding mental health within the South Asian community. But it ended up being such a blessing because I was able to connect and relate and say things to her because she understood where I was coming from. And I think there's a big importance on that part of like having clinicians, even in that referral list, that represent the student population, because sometimes like that part is missing. And I do personally feel more comfortable talking to a South Asian clinician because I don't have to explain everything and they get the culture and they get where I'm coming from.
yeah. No, I think that that's a really good point, right? Is the underrepresentation of mental health professionals who represent those different cultures, right? And different views.
Dr. Boyd, are you still with us?
Dr. Boyd.
I think you're phone issues. Okay, well, we'll still continue on, Dr. Boyd. If you come back in, please join us. And so one of the things, Dr. Rex, that we can also continue on is what's your biggest challenge to talking to youth about mental health and COVID? Has that been an issue, or has that been something that, like, how do you approach that?
Right. I mean, I think one of the biggest issues just with in general, I guess it's not really an issue. So I don't want to generalize, but a lot of people see mental health as a weakness, right? That you can't handle something, or you're not equipped enough to handle something. And I think that there's a lot of youth who feel like they need to be tough right now, and who, feel like they need to hold it together. And some of that is just based on the fact that it's kind of a crazy time. And so in order to survive, they have to put on a particular persona. So I've definitely seen that as kind of a little bit of a challenge in mental health, is just kind of setting goals, because I don't think many of them think that they have goals. The other part about youth mental health is a lot of times youth are seeking help because somebody's told them to. So I think in general, which really doesn't have to do with COVID, just has to do with that population in general, is, they're there because their parents are taking them there. And then you have a handful of them who love it and want to be there, and those are the best. And then you have the ones who eventually do love it, but it's usually not their first choice, it's somebody else's first choice. So I think that's always a little bit of a barrier that we have to overcome when we're building our relationships with them.
Well,
Yeah, I would agree. Did I freeze? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, but we can hear you.
We can still hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm going. I thought I froze. I'm a move. Oh, am I up now?
You're good. You're good.
I'm moving to another part. Okay. I'm blurry now. Okay. I'm the one with the technical difficulties. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
So, yeah. I mean, I think that is. I just agree that getting youth into treatment has always been challenging, and part of it is trying to make that connection early on. It seems like I think I wish sometimes we maybe do more like a drop-in mental health. Our expectation is often that someone comes in to see us for a long time, and I noticed that sometimes pre-COVID, that sometimes you come back when they're not feeling good, they leave and may come back if you have that relationship. So I terminated with a couple of teens early on, and some of them came back during COVID because their parents noticed symptoms, but we already had that relationship, so it was easy to re-engage them in treatment. And the goal is not for maybe to be long-term. I'm hoping that, we kind of get through COVID and then they can go back. And so I think we may need some shifting even in mental health about sort of how we see our role. And I think there's some models that may be helping people get through short period of time, and not that you have to lay on a couch and sort of be there for years with someone. It's not the expectation. So.
Oh, Thank you so much. I'm going to kind of head into a little bit of questions from our participants, and I believe this might be from a teacher. Anxiety is on the rise for my junior high students this year. What are some coping strategies that they can share with the individual and at home?
No, I agree. It's a lot of anxiety. Part of it is sort of, there are things that people can use like deep breathing that helps, and you can do that anywhere. You can also do muscle relaxation techniques, which is helpful, and you can do them anywhere. Also, many times if they get overwhelmed by their worrying, you can have like worry time. So they may have like 10 minutes where they worry and then let it go for the rest of the day. So there's different techniques that they can use to kind of help them kind of get control of it, because it is a very stressful time, as been mentioned, and that youth has to figure out how to control so that it won't be too overwhelming, the anxiety.
Yeah. I think adding some, SEL curriculum in to what you can do in the classroom also, because I think a lot of their anxiety, well, first of all, that population is anxious anyways. So this is just a double whammy, right? So I think, I think that adding some of that kind of conversation around social emotional learning opens up the space for students to feel like they're not the only one that feels that way, which then brings a sense of camaraderie to the group. And then that actually eases their anxiety because they don't feel like they're the only one. A lot of times that anxiety comes from a place of feeling like I'm the only one who feels this way. I'm all by myself. So I think like some of that is just creating that space in the class to be able to have like-minded conversations.
And even like we just had another question kind of come in, kind of piggybacking off of this, like how can adults, even teachers or caregivers, cope with emotional stress and feeling alone, especially with what's going on in the world right now, in conjunction to like our kids and teenagers?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, at least, so the way that I typically do therapy with my adults or teenagers is really around identity. So we do a lot of work around what are your strengths, what are your values, who are you? Because no matter what situation you're in, that's who you are. And that in itself kind of relieves a little bit of that grief and loss that's happening right now. And I think the reminder as much as you can that the situation is temporary, but the thing that's not temporary is you, right? So you're still who, I think that kind of grounding that you can do in kind of, even if it's in something that where you're writing lists, like today my strengths were this, or this is something that I realized I'm really good at today, or whatever, and building that kind of sense of identity gives you more of that kind of grounding feeling so that things aren't just so out of your control.
I think we talked a little bit before. I'll just add, and I know we talked about for parents, about the self-care. I think it's important that this pandemic has shown us that we have to take care of ourselves. And I think often as adults, we're pretty tough on thinking that we should be maybe functioning at a high level. And I just think no one is really performing at a high level at this point, and that we have to kind of be okay to be functioning at 75% or even 50% of what we used to, and that's okay, because that's what everyone is doing. It's sleep, eating, exercise, taking a break, reading a book, Netflix, so whatever you have to do to kind of feel good, whatever those things, journaling, things like that, you have to take care of your emotional and physical well-being. They're connected.
And how can
not judging yourself. Sorry, I just wanted to add to that. And the reason I was laughing is because one of the best articles I read back in March and April when all this started was something that told me that I did not have to do all the home projects that were on my list while I was home. And I was like, thank goodness somebody gave me permission to not do these big things. And I mean, because really we just judge ourselves so much, so that's why I was laughing at what you said.
And I think some of the questions that kind of popped up have a similar theme of like how, and we've touched on this too, but like how can teachers especially support the mental health of their students of all backgrounds in conjunction to remote learning?
Part of it is checking in with the students about how they're doing. And also, I think like attending forums like this or understanding what's going on, there's a lot of resources out there in mental health, so that maybe if something happens, that then you could be aware and reach out to the student. Because I think part of it is the teachers are overwhelmed with what the new demands, the changes, their life. And so being able to kind of maybe notice their changes in youth and certain symptoms, so that they can kind of reach out and maybe contact the family and sort of identify those things and not view it maybe as a negative behavior. Because I think that's often what we've noticed, is that particularly youth of color, certain behaviors are viewed more negatively, and it leads to negative consequences, disciplinary actions instead of mental health treatment. And so stopping that cycle and being able to identify that's a trauma symptom, not that they have antisocial personality disorder or so. And so how you interpret these behaviors that you exhibit is important.
Thank you. And so we're almost out of time, but I wanted to kind of give you guys the last minute or so to kind of, is there anything else that you wanted to add that we did not talk about? I just did share both of your information, how they can contact either one of you. And then I've also provided resources from afsp.org related to suicide prevention resources, as well as minority mental health resources as well.
I guess I'll just bring up, and I think it's slightly brought up, that as adults now, we don't have all the answers. I think this is one thing that's uncomfortable sometimes. Mm-hmm. I don't even know what to tell my patients about what's going to happen. Typically, you say, oh, it'll be okay. Not that things won't be okay, but this is what will happen. Oh, I'm concerned about going to high school. You kind of know what's going to happen when they go to high school generally. We don't know. And so it's okay to admit that we don't know, and we're learning as they're learning. And we're just going to try to figure this out together. And we're all worried and anxious and stressed about it. And we'll do the best we can. And I think that's the piece of being maybe accepting that we don't have the answers for the children these days.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's huge. I think the other thing to pay attention to is compassion fatigue. When you're in a caregiving role or a teaching role, I mean, the element of compassion fatigue is there anyways, and now it's just kind of added to that because you're even having fatigue for taking care of your own family while you're taking care of somebody else's, while you're taking care of 30 children in a classroom or whatever. And I think paying attention to your own reactions is really important, and not judging yourself for them, but maybe, for lack of a better term, tapping out when you need to, asking for help, not just for your child or your students, but like, for yourself, asking for a teammate to jump in, maybe doing a little extra work, on yourself just to figure things out. Just pay attention to those signs. I think that can impact how we react to the kids.
Thank you so much for both of you for joining us. And if you or anyone you know is struggling with suicidal ideation or thoughts, or even has attempted, please do reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255. And I think by 2022, the hotline number will be 988, I believe. And that will be in the works. And then also there's a crisis text line as well that you can also text anonymously to as well. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will be the DEI committee will be hosting future panels similar to this, but conversations as well. So please join us again. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And thank you so much, Dr. Boyd and Dr. Wax, for being a part of this discussion.
I appreciate this discussion. It's much needed.
Yeah, I could talk about this all night. Like, I don't want to go. I could just.
Well, actually, Dr. Wax was one of my supervisors I trained under her for a little bit. And we're so grateful to be able to connect with you as well, Dr. Boyd.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. It was nice talking with you all. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Alrighty. Okay.